Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to today's webinar. It's exactly 4 minutes past 2, and I think we can start. Welcome to today's webinar, and I am pleased to welcome our speaker today, Mr. Talent Nesangano, who is a PhD candidate in economics at Trinity College in Dublin, whose research spans development economics, labor economics, and economic history. Today, Talent will present from an essay-tied research on the lasting effects of apartheid-era labor policies and how they continue to shape labor allocations in South Africa. Talent, without wasting any time, I'm going to hand over to you, and then you can present to us your paper. Thanks. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ubuntu. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So today I'll be presenting this paper, which is a UN-wide essay-tied working paper. Special thanks to UN-wide and the South African government for financial support and also granting access to the use of the data. So the topic is legacy of apartheid, misallocation of labor and firm productivity. It's a co-authored paper that I author with Carol Newman and Marvin Seuss from Trinity College Dublin, who are also my supervisors for the PhD, and John Rand from University of Copenhagen. So basically, one of the central questions in development economics right now is why are some economies or regions within are less productive than others? One of the leading explanations of this is misallocation of labor or capital or in general resources across firms. And in this paper, we focus on one of the resources that are used in production by firms, which is labor. So by misallocation, we mean if workers are not in the jobs where they are most productive, then in that case, aggregate productivity declines. So what are the sources of these misallocations or of the frictions that we see in the economy that leads to other regions or economies being less productive than others? So the sources usually emanate from labor market regulations, barriers that limit workers' ability to move from one job to the other. If you have skills, you may be limited to be in a better job because of spatial restrictions or labor market frictions. So generally, what we understand at the moment is that labor market regulations or sticky rules in terms of sticky rules in firing or regulations that limit mobility of workers affect the allocation of workers, as they could not move from one job to the other or probably one place to the other because of spatial restrictions. So what we don't really understand at the moment is, are these laws or regulations that are promulgated that restrict labor allocation, will they persist after they've been removed or they've been reformed? So South Africa provides a unique setup for us to study this because of the legacy of the apartheid regime that existed 1948 to 1994, which kind of like institutionalized discrimination. So we can see the racial labor market restrictions from the law using the historical documents, and these applied through across sectors and districts. So the questions of this paper are simple. We want to start, to what extent does historical legacy of apartheid explain contemporary misallocation of labor? And what would be the consequences of this legacy for firm productivity? To have an understanding of the historical context of this law, that this treatment that we use in our study, I would give a historical context of South Africa. So racial discrimination in South Africa was sanctioned by law, and this was kind of like, they existed since early 1900s, but they became more formalized since 1948. when the National Party won election, campaigning through the same ideology of protecting the white minority. Sorry, is there a question?
No, go ahead, Talent.
Okay, I heard like an echo or someone trying to talk. So the main laws that we focus on in our study are Industrial Conciliation Act and Wage Act of 1956. So I'll explain how these kind of like evolved. In 1948, when National Party came into law, to become a leading party, they had promised the white minorities that they would protect them against black competition in the labor market. So the Industrial Conciliation Act has two important sections, which is Section 48, which was regulating the wages, and Section 77, which which gave power the Minister of Labor to protect certain sectors or occupations based on race. And the map that you're seeing here will tell us the effect of one of the prominent laws, which was the Population Registration Act, which categorized South Africans into racial groups, that is white, black, colored, Indians, or Asians. So in this case, it was also the Group Areas Act, which then created these colored small polygons that you see on the map on the right. So sorry, is that a question or something?
I think the sound is coming from your side, Talent, because everybody is muted until the Q&A session.
No, Victor H, VH, someone was talking. I was seeing someone called Victor who was talking, so I was asking if it was a question or something. They just muted.
No, he just muted. Sorry about that. You can continue.
Okay, so I was saying like the Group Areas Act created 10 ethnically distinct homelands, or what they called them Bantustans, where it's recorded that 3.5 million people were moved away from urban or industrialized areas to be in those homelands, which created kind of like a spatial restriction of movement of black workers to go to access opportunities. So based on these two laws that we focus on in our paper, if you are interested in the more history about how these restrictions, this paper is now a working paper, it's available online. And if it becomes too technical, you can use the blog, which is also available on the UN-wide blog site. So these laws, we focus mainly on the restrictions that were targeted at the occupational mobility. And there were three mechanisms that we focus on from the law, which is the closed shop agreements, which reserved jobs for white workers who were members of the trade unions, and the minimum wages, which would be set prohibitively to outcompete black workers, and also the job reservation policies, which was Section 77, where the minister would use these to target, to restrict occupations of a certain type or certain skilled jobs for the white workers. In terms of the job reservations, these targeted 13 sectors, and these are documented in a lot of historical documents. They state the actual 13 sectors, and there were 28 determinations that were made since 1957 to 1975. And then if you look at the special restrictions that existed during the time, there were a lot of special restrictions that were included, like the pass laws, where blacks would need authority to be in white areas. So those clear parts of the map that you see here, the map shows also like the current provincial capitals. So in those clear maps, which are not colored polygons, those were the restricted areas where blacks would need pass laws to be there. And there was also what were called labor bureaus, which were created to be institutions that would match black workers to jobs. And one trick that was there with the labor bureaus was that if you lose a job or you enter into a white area, you had to register and you had 72 hours of accessing a job. If you don't get a job, you have to go back to the homelands. And if you tend to get a job, you are matched to a job and you don't like the job, theoretically, the law said the black workers had the right to deny the opportunity, but they would not come back into the bureau list. So it created kind of like an artificial unemployment and job frictions. And then these homelands, people had to live in these homelands. And at some point, they started to introduce what were called deconcentration centers, which were industrial centers close to the homelands so that people would commute and go back to the homelands. So this is kind of the variation that we exploit in our study. The data sources, we use the South African Revenue Service and National Treasury data sets using 2012 to 2018, but this data extends beyond that, but this is the period that we could calculate the measures that we use in the study. So in the SARS-NT Treasury Matched Firm panel, we extract sales costs of the firm, also deflectors that we use to deflate the variables. And then in the employee income payroll certificates, that's where we get firm locations, which is an indirect way where we assume if we see a location of the of work of an employee, then that's where the firm that they work from is located. And then we also use the postal codes data to map this data into the historical maps. And then in terms of the historical data, we use what is called the South African government gazettes. Thanks for the funding that we got to scrape this data. In as much as it's not complete corpus of the laws, we got like 2,600 corpus text that would help in creating the treatment variable. And we use a DSTAB geospatial database, which is also a South African project, which provides administrative boundaries of South Africa since 1911 to 2011, and it matches locations as they change. But in this data, we focus mainly on the 1991 magistral districts shapefile and also urban agglomeration data, which we use for our treatment variables. Manpower survey, it also helps in creating kind of like an enforcement treatment, which we call uptake in this data, which shows us how much were these restrictions enforced by firms. So, and then we also use the census 1991 for the locations and other variables which are important for the study, and other external data sources like the US permanent locations, which is the green card in short, that will be popular to many if I use that. It's the green card. It shows us the demand of skilled workers in the US, which we use for our mechanisms. And then we also use we are still exploiting the other sources like the RIDP to exploit the mechanisms for the effects that you find in this study. The measurement of variables. So when we say labor misallocation, one would be wondering, how do we measure this? So we measure this using the labor productivity, which is the returns of labor for a firm. And we calculate the dispersion, which is the standard deviation of log marginal revenue product across firms within sector districts over time. And then the assumption there, people would say, what does it really imply? So if there are no frictions, we expect the marginal revenue products of firms to equalize. But if we see there is kind of like a difference between across firms, which means there are frictions which are happening in across firms within sectors. And then we also calculate firm productivity, which is total factor productivity, which is value-added based. We can't recover actual output in the tax administration data, so we use an imputed method. The treatment variables here are binary. So the main treatment variable is legacy regulatory, which is a binary indicator. It's an equal 1 if a sector and district was mentioned to have been enforcing the closed shop agreements in the law, or there were minimum wage restrictions in the law, or skewed reservations where those 13 sectors that I was talking about, if they were implemented in the sector district, then it's a 1. So we had 44 treated sectors, which are 3-digit sectors here. If you are asking what are the sectors, then it's food manufacturing industry, or the banking industry, insurance industry, and so forth. And then this right side map that you're seeing with green color, it shows the locations that were mentioned in the laws to have been enforcing the restrictions. So these are 278 magisterial districts as at 1991. These are no longer being used in South Africa. And then we also use another measure, which is to focus on the specific targeted job reservations, which is 13 sectors. And some of the sectors that were targeted here are textiles, sweets manufacturing, and so forth. But you can see the whole list in the paper. We have them there. Here, I'm trying to just give examples so that for context. So this 44 times 278 then becomes our treatment in this study, and the remainder becomes the control group. So those will be the non-treated, and within the green color, you would have other sectors that were not treated that fall in that sector. So it gives us kind of like intent to treat measure. Then we have another measure, which is the legacy uptake. So these 3 measures, you have to take kind of note of them, because as I'm jumping soon onto the methodology and also the results, they will matter for your understanding of what exactly we are getting as the results of these measures. So the legacy uptake, this is a measure that we use the local municipalities. We change the approach. We use local municipalities, and then we identify local municipalities that had urban areas as at 1991, and remove areas that were homelands. So the initial map that I showed you, not to contaminate this. So it shows us at this occupation sector mobility restrictions that were implemented during the apartheid. This is where the manpower survey came into play. It shows us the data of occupations that were restricted and the rest. So we calculate the intensity of this using that data. Empirical strategy for labor misallocation. So we estimate 2 equations. So here I'll start by explaining the labor misallocation part, and then show you the total factor productivity equation later after discussing the results of misallocation. So this YSK in bracket JT is the misallocation of labor, which I said this is the standard deviation of log marginal revenue product of labor in a sector, district, over time. And the coefficient of interest here, it's beta here. I don't know if you are seeing, it seems my cursor cannot be shown here, but the something like B here, which is where we have legacy SK after that. So the treatment here is binary. It's keeping the sector and district, the multiplication of sector and district that were treated as at 1991 locations. And then we control for factors that could be endogenous to our outcome, which is average firm average firm size, average wages within sector districts, and average worker time, average worker age. And we also use fixed effects to control for macroeconomic shocks. We also use sector fixed effects here, which is delta S, to control for sector specific time invariant effects. And we control for sector time invariant effects, which is tariff changes, the reforms that happened that affects our sectors, and also K here, J. This is kind of like the district fixed effect. And we also use the province fixed effect to kind of like come up with a broader regional channels, to exploit broader regional channels that could affect misallocation of labor in South Africa. So this is kind of like a broad measure. It gives us kind of like a bandwidth of lower bound and upper bound. So some may say like, but this could be endogenous. So we argue that this is exogenous, plausibly exogenous, because we use, this treatment is coming from a 40-year lag period between where these laws applied and the outcomes that we use. And also we fix the locations that are used in the study in 1991, where these magistral districts are now defunct and no longer used for policy formulation in South Africa. And the demand of these restrictions had nothing to do with workers or firms themselves, but a particular group. And at some instance, when we look at Legacy 77, it's kind of like a top-down rule setting by the government. In terms of results, so here we implement this in a stepwise approach. So for the specification, which uses a tighter identification strategy, we have here for legacy of apartheid, we have legacy regulator here. So if we don't control for anything here, the legacy of apartheid here, it shows us like a higher value, where if you calculate this coefficient, which is 0.041, you divide it by the mean labor misallocation, which is 0.627, and express it as a percentage, you would have a very high misallocation of about 12% misallocation of labor relative to the mean against the untreated group. And if you look at the targeted targeted group here, it's even higher, which is Legacy 77. But not to waste your time with these kind of like econometric isolation of effects, we have to focus on column 4 and 5, but I'll start with column 4. So if you look at the coefficient 0.025 with a star here, it shows that legacy of apartheid, looking at the broader measure of apartheid, which is the regulator which covers the minimum wages, closed shop agreements, and skill reservations, this is a 4% effect relative to the mean of the treated group versus the untreated group. But if we look at it from the perspective of the 13 targeted sectors, which is Legacy 77, you have like 8% of the effect. So the difference of the coefficients between the Legacy 77 and the Legacy regulator, it's 4 percentage points. It shows that the targeted sectors were more affected compared to the broader measure, which means these effects of legacy of apartheid, it's still persisting within the 13 sectors more compared when we look at it from the broader perspective. And then if we relax our identification a bit, we will see that the coefficients here, if you are doing your mathematics, you'll see for legacy of apartheid, it becomes 6% here. And then if you look at it from the bottom here, top legacy 77, it moves to 14%. This is where we get the bandwidth, where we say it varies from 4% to 14%, the effects. And please take note of this, because we have missing gazettes, and for the legacy 77, it's more targeted. This coefficient is kind of at the lower bound rather than at the overestimation of legacy of apartheid. So the effects could be higher than this if we had all the corpus of the text that we were implemented during this period. So looking at the legacy uptake, it still confirms that we have the legacy of apartheid. Just focusing on column 4, it shows us that the range of apartheid in terms of the enforcement, because here it was about like whether the firms were abiding by the laws or not, they could still find ways to evade this. But in terms of looking at the data that is existing in terms of enforcement, we find 2% to 3% effect, which is kind of like a confirmation that this legacy of apartheid, indeed, it's still persisting, even if we change the measurement of the treatment variable. So in terms of decomposing, we decompose the effects to look at the components individually. So if we are to look at panel A here, we have minimum wages. Panel B, we have closed shop agreements. And panel C, we have skill reservations. They are all showing that, like, if you look at the minimum wage and you have checked the coefficients, how they varied in the previous, you would see minimum wage is the dominant measure here, and it's confirming the effects throughout for the different specifications. And column 4 is still at the same size as the legacy of apartheid regulator. But however, we find out that close the shop and skilled reservations, they tend to flip the sign, which means in this case, the attenuation that we find here, or this flip of the sign, it shows that these operated at a more granular enforcement, and they seem to have been eroded by the reforms that have been implemented by apartheid. So the effects that we find in the main treatment comes from the minimum wage, which are still showing even today. So we jump on to mechanisms. We test capital intensity. Of course, this is endogenous, the way we calculate it, but we just tried to use the data that we have, but we are still trying to implement the new measures from the lab. From the external data, which is exogenous, we have created that data, and we are hoping we will be able to have new set of results anytime soon. So here in capital intensity, we see that the nature of the industries that apartheid shaped determines what happens with the legacy of apartheid. So if we are to look at this measure that we calculate, which is called share of capital intensive firms within sector districts, it shows that for the broader measure here, these tend to be more impactful in labor-intensive sectors. And we can see from the decomposition of the legacy regulator that job reservations and closed shop agreements tend to have been eroded by the reforms. And this is confirming that. So it's capital intensive. It's also kind of like affecting labor-intensive firms. But if we look at the 13 targeted sectors for job reservation, which was more to do with skill-specific jobs, it still persists for the capital-intensive sectors. So, but we do not find any difference for the labor-intensive sectors. It's not an effect there, but it shows that the skill issue is important for those sectors that were targeted by 13 sectors that reserved job reservations. So we jump on to the out-migration, which is kind of like a historically documented phenomenon where it's in the history, it shows that since around 1990s to 1994 or post end of apartheid, there was kind of like an exodus of a movement of white skilled workers away from South Africa. They emigrated a lot. So we tried to test if this is kind of like a measure or a channel in which legacy of apartheid is persisting, where probably the skilled workers would have moved away, because in the history of South Africa, there was a Bantu education that created a different education for Black workers, which would have kind of like impeded the creation of skill in the bigger population. And so if we tend to have these skilled workers leaving the economy, what would be the effect? We don't find an effect that this could be a possible channel. And we are still trying to see other mechanisms like the regional industrial development plan. We have that data. And then we are also going to test like the new policies that were created, like the sector education training data expenditures, whether this would be some mitigating effects on legacy of apartheid. So I jump on to firm productivity. So with firm productivity here, this regression is at the firm level, and the treatment is still the same, but here the difference is we are looking at total factor productivity of firm I in sector S, district K, and time T, and legacy is binary indicator, sector time, and it's time invariant again. We control for firm size and capital intensity in this regression, and a bunch of sector fixed effects. Here we don't use the province. We continue with a tight specification. The results here show that firms that are in the sector district pairs that were treated do not exhibit lower average firm productivity compared to their counterparts who fall in the sector district pairs that were not treated. So what does this mean? It means that there are no differences, like the firms that were falling in these treated groups tend to have upgraded or copied with the new technologies or regressed the effects that of apartheid over time. So this could be probably adoption of new technologies and also accessing labor and trying to use their labor more efficiently without being affected by the legacy of apartheid. So in general, what we find here is that historically restricted sector district pairs exhibit 4 to 14% higher labor misallocation than their counterparts. Minimum wages remain the main driver of these misallocations that comes from labor market frictions, and job reservations and closed shop agreements operated through highly localized exclusions that has likely been eroded post-apartheid by post-apartheid reforms. We do not observe any differences in terms of TFP. So what it means, legacy of apartheid operates through allocative inefficiencies rather than differences in firm efficiency or ex-efficiency of firms. So what does it mean in terms of the policy implications? So here we have what we think at the moment, but this is not kind of like the final judgment of our paper, because we still have to test other mechanisms, like there have been like transport network investments that have been happening in South Africa. We have to test that. We also have to test like the housing development in the urban areas, whether this could kind of like mediate the effects of labor misallocation that comes from the legacy of apartheid. And we are still yet to see what the sector training expenditures have been doing, because this is kind of like a skill capacitation measures that we have. So at the moment, what we can just say is post-apartheid reforms have not been sufficient to undo institutionally rooted labor misallocation. As we find minimum wages to be the main driver of this effect. So which means these minimum wage policies could be still extending the misallocation frictions the labor allocation frictions that existed historically in South Africa. So policies that would address allocative distortions in this case would be much welcome in addressing this type of misallocation that we find. With that, I say thank you.
Thank you so much, Talent, for such a thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much. And now we're going to open the session for questions or comments.
Do you still want me to be putting the slides on, or I should drop it?
You can just keep it on if maybe there's a question that goes back to a slide.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Talent.
Afternoon. I just wanted to find out when the final report with the outstanding information would be made available. And also following on that, what do we see as the way forward? Is current policies actually addressing these differences, or how do we mind this gap? Thank you.
Obed, yes, you can come through.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon to all colleagues in the platform. Yes, indeed, the study is really thought-provoking. So from my side, the comment and the question that I have, it's in terms of having this particular study or this particular research as such. Did you also consider the issue of risk reduction? As a country, we recently hosted the G20 summit, and with specific focus on risk reduction. And my question is in terms of what is there any conclusive remarks from your side, or did you not even consider or look at the issue of risk reduction, especially on the rural areas? Because in terms of the map that you've shown, especially from the whole issue of the Bantu stance, where as it is right now, the issue of risk reduction and disasters is not necessarily considered, and surely that's got to do with the division of revenue raised nationally. So is it because in terms of your study you did not concentrate on that, or is it something that maybe can be considered? And lastly, it's on the fiscal framework itself, because that also has a bearing on how the whole issue of capacity is built within those rural areas. And also when you look as to how the current labor laws can also deal with the issue of specific jobs that were reserved to only white people. So I think those were my comments and questions. And the specific issue that I had, it's with regards to, like I said, on the fiscal framework from National Treasury, as to what has been done with regards to the issue of infrastructure, which I think maybe somehow in your study you will have to touch, because there hasn't been any level of intensity and intentionality in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Obed. Talent, I don't see any other questions. I think you can go ahead and answer those two that came through.
Okay, thank you, Nobuntu. Unfortunately, people didn't mention their names, so I'm not seeing. But the first part, in terms of how do we mind about this gap? So in terms of the report, this paper is already out as a working paper. Like I said, it's there on the SA-Tide UN-wide website. And there's a blog for non-technical people to really engage with this topic. And we will be very welcome to receive any feedback that you think is important or other things that you think we could look at. But in terms of how should we mind about this gap, like I said, in the policy implications, we are seeing that minimum wages are still kind of like the main channel in which this labor misallocation is persisting in South Africa. So one thing that we have to first test is also in terms of like labor mobility channels. So that's why I think this I would join with a little bit of the other question that is asking about infrastructure. We are still waiting for the data. We requested the data from the government of South Africa to provide us access to the additional data for mechanisms. So at this point, it's really difficult to really say this is the concrete policy recommendation that we can give. But at the moment, what we are seeing is the channel that is driving this, it's minimum wages, and it could be also to do with labor mobility, where we had people that were moved outside of the places of opportunity, but we don't know whether the policies that have been implemented at the moment in terms of infrastructure development, transport network, so for people to access opportunities, or probably the housing facilities that have been pushed by government, whether they've worked to address this. We are not yet sure because we haven't tested those mechanisms. And also, we are also going to test like the kind of like locations of industrialization, because you would see that around 1982 to 1991 and thereabout, there is what is called the regional industrial development planning that happened, which introduced like industrial concentration centers, deconcentration centers, and industrial development centers. So this policy targeted two things: to make sure that people stay where they are, and there were incentives that were given to firms to set up firms closer to the Bantustans. But did these kind of like firms continue to work? Do we still have industries flourishing in those areas? Were they feasible? Because from the literature, it shows that most of the firms didn't want to go there because of difficulties in accessing certain services. So it could have been probably one of the channels that we can say, okay, this is why it's persisting. So it's too early for me to really say this is what the government should do, but we are working on that. And then the second part, I'm not so sure if I got the risk reduction part here, but I can answer the other question, which led to like infrastructure, which is related to the same question again, that we are going to test a lot of data sets on infrastructure development expenditure that the government of South Africa have been spending on. They've been trying to make sure that there's access to housing in towns, so which is also part of the areas of opportunities. There is also infrastructure in terms of the infrastructure in terms of road networks. And then there is also the SETA data, which is the sector educational trainings training centers where they kind of like target certain sectors. I think there are 21 sectors that have data on what they've been doing, and we can get this data, I think, as early as 2008, but some sectors, they don't have data for the prior years. So we are still working on how we can incorporate this expenditure data in terms of capacitating people, whether this has been working or not. So I think once we get that, then we will have concrete policy recommendations. I don't know if I have answered the questions.
Thank you, Obed. Thank you, Talent. I think you've covered both questions from Obed and the first speaker. And there's a question for you as well on the chat from Portia. She's asking, on your own opinion, do you think South Africa has improved since the end of apartheid in terms of labor?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I can only speak from what the data is showing me. To some extent, it shows that the reforms are working, because you can see when we kind of like disentangle the labor regulations that were implemented during the apartheid regime, you would see like the closed shop agreements where blacks were not allowed to be part of the trade unions, that have been removed. And I think there have been like a lot of reforms that took place in South Africa in terms of that front, in terms of whether the workers' agendas are represented very well. So which means us having a negative coefficient there, it shows that definitely this is working. And the closed shop agreements, which means they no longer exist, right? So there is definitely an improvement in terms of the labor regulations in South Africa. But it's also something that we need to take note of, because labor minimum wages have been kind of documented to have different kind of effects in the labor market. And we are still finding also this, and this is kind of like a new channel that we are finding for misallocation of labor, where minimum wages would restrict movement of reallocation of labor. So it's still to some extent there are weaknesses, but I think the reforms have been working. Thank you.
Thanks, Talent. And I have Dr. Moluko. I don't know that you want to come in and say your comment, Dr. Moluko.
Good afternoon. I had thought that by just posting them in the chat box, our colleagues will be able to see them and appreciate them. Let me first express my sincere gratitude to the good presentation that is here, and also express my gratitude to the fact that there's a working paper that is there, where people who are interested in the topics and who are committed to transformation can make further contribution. My contribution is just to emphasize what has already been said, but to highlight the fact that apartheid was not merely a political system. It was a comprehensive labor engineering project designed to racially structure the economy, suppress African human potential, and entrench a hierarchy of skills, wages, and opportunities. Its legacy still persists, even if there are some improvements, especially because people talking about reforms, not transformation. And in the legacy that persists is in the form of misallocation, spatial inequality, skills deficits, and firm level productivity constraint. So the challenge that is here for all of us as practitioners is that we must be able to move government and all the other sectors, including the private sector, not to talk about this transformation that is necessary, but to act so that we can then be able to say that there is progress in having to see to it that African human potential is released and it flourishes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maluku, for your comment and views on this topic. Don't see any other hands or questions. Talent, I think you're on mute if you are saying anything.
No, I'm not trying to say anything. I'm just waiting if people have something to say. Yeah.
It looks like your presentation was comprehensive enough. I don't see any other questions or comments. And like Talent said, the presentation was available on GTAC's Knowledge Hub, as well as on SA Tide's blog, and the links are posted on the chat. And without having any other further questions, I think we can close the session. And I'm going to ask again to remind people, please rate us. How was the session? I've put in a link on the chat where you can rate how was the presentation. How did you find it? Your feedback is really important to us. And do visit our platforms, which is Knowledge Hub, for further information on the presentation that was shared today. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everybody.